So The Highlanders is the show's final pure historical and brought an end to the show really trying to inform the audience about the past. Obviously, the most notable thing about this serial is the introduction of one of the most famous classic era companions, Jamie McCrimmon, who would go on to be one of the longest lasting in the show's history. But how good is this serial as a whole? Well, let's find out by heading back to 1746. So The Highlanders has a decent bit going on and does a good job at sticking you in the time period. The Doctor, Ben and Polly arrive during the Battle of Culloden, where they soon meet several Jacobites who are hiding from the British, notably the Laird, Kirsty and Jamie McCrimmon. So the plot follows the trio as they are split up and captured by the Redcoats, with them eventually making their way to Inverness where they fight for their freedom. A simple enough plot, but the journey to that freedom is the interesting bit of course, especially for the Doctor and Polly. So Polly becomes separated from the others very early on while trying to get water with the Redcoats discovering the hiding place and preparing to hang everyone. This leads to her trying to rescue her friends, which really shows Polly at her best, with her really pushing events forward and creating situations that will help them later. So she's paired with Kirsty, who is the daughter of the Laird, who together make their way to Inverness with them trapping a Redcoat, Lieutenant Algernon Finch, who they take money from, as well as his identification and a lock of his hair, so they have power over him for the remainder of the story. Now Polly's understanding of the era is interesting, as there is a scene in which she decides to disguise them both as orange sellers so they can sneak around to find the others, which seems like a more obscure fact about the time period than the current war, but doesn't seem to understand that the Redcoats are at war with the Jacobites, even after being told so, which leads to her nearly giving herself and Kirsty away in episode 1. I mean, it could have just been her not recognising them as a danger out of instinct, but that's something which doesn't come up in other historicals. But anyway, the majority of Polly's plot takes place in episodes 2 and 3, while they're separated from everyone else, with her becoming much less impactful in episode 4, which is a more action-packed episode, with the taking of the ship and freeing of Ben, Jamie and others. Polly's dynamic with Finch is interesting, as she goes from having complete power over him through having the proof that she captured him, but, and this might just be me, but I swear he has a thing for her by the end, as I think there is something flirtatious in their final interactions. I'll discuss Ben now, who spends almost the entire plot with Jamie, mostly locked in cells within buildings or boats. After being captured in episode 1, episodes 2 and 3 are just being in cells, until the cliffhanger of episode 3, which has Ben being forced to walk the plank. I haven't too much to say about Ben in this serial, but he does have a notable rebellious moment in episode 3 when he tears up contracts which would have turned the captured Jacobites into slaves, which is what leads him being forced to walk the plank. Apart from that, I can't remember anything else about Ben's importance to the serial, because it's mostly a Doctor and Polly story. I suppose being held captive for around half of the serial does that to a guy, plus due to him escaping his apparent death in episode 4, it means that he isn't a notable part of the final battle and the defeat of Trask. Ben definitely drew the short end of the straw in this serial, which does make a change. So now onto the Doctor, who obviously does the most and has the most memorable scenes of the serial. This is due to him constantly putting on fake accents or disguises, which lets Troughton play the role far more humorously than he could in Power, which will lead into the truest characterisation of this incarnation in only a few serials' time. To go over his disguises, we first have his German doctor, which he uses in the first 2 episodes, first to play around with the Redcoats and gain power through the law, and later to escape from the cell in Inverness. The latter focuses on the Doctor's side of his disguise. In the case of the escape from the cell, he uses the personal standard of Bonnie Prince Charlie, which was being kept safe by the Laird, to get a meeting with Grey, who I'll discuss more later. The Doctor goes in by deceiving Grey to make him think that he's on his side before locking him in a cupboard and then outwitting his clerk, Perkins, by making him under the illusion he's ill and must rest. He does also deceive Grey again with a very similar trick during episode 4, but this time saying that Bonnie Prince Charlie is on board the ship, which I should start calling by its name, the Annabelle. The only other thing to note about the Doctor when using the accent is this interaction, in which the Doctor says his fake name and an English officer says Doctor Who, and the Doctor says, yes, that's what I said. Given that this interaction also happened in the Gunfighters, either the Doctor is just screwing with people, can't be bothered to repeat these fake names, or maybe Who is just a translation of his actual name and these aliases are other translations. In this case, Dr. Von Ver translates to Doctor of Who. But of course we have the most notable disguise, that of an old woman, which allows him to sneak around without being paid much attention. A lot of the sillier moments of this serial comes from this disguise, either the fun back and forth with Polly when they reunite, or when he encounters Perkins in the tavern. The final disguise is that of a redcoat soldier, which he briefly takes up at the beginning of episode 4, which he wears a fake moustache with. Since I've mentioned them a few times, I'll talk about the side characters, beginning with Grey and Perkins. So Grey was a Royal Commissioner of Prisons who wanted to sell Jacobites as slaves in the West Indies, with him working with Trask, who was a sailor who took the Annabelle from its original captain, William Mackay, who was a smuggler of weapons for the Jacobites. Grey isn't the most interesting of characters, but is a good villain for the serial, being very real and down to earth as a greedy man who is twisting the law for his own gain, which probably makes him one of the scarier villains of the show, like with a lot of the historical villains, with Grey being an actual historical figure and the only one in this serial. I don't have anything to say about Trask, but I will note that he seems to be a character which someone liked, as he seems to have gone on to bigger things after his death, as he returns in an 8th Doctor book from the late 90s. Perkins isn't the most interesting of characters, he's comic relief, often being the worse off for his association with Grey, whether that being because of wine being thrown in his face, he's the one being forced to pay the bribes, or just generally being mistreated, with him changing his allegiance at the end and joining Willie McKay and the Jacobites on the recaptured Annabelle, mostly because it's the safest option for him. The final notable side character is Finch, but I've discussed him before with his dynamic with Polly, but he does allow the trio to go free at the end and plays a part in the arrest of Grey. That's sort of it for the side characters. The Leia doesn't do much while Kirsty is more important, but a lot of her impact I've discussed with the Polly stuff. But I will note that she has a ring which belonged to Bonnie Prince Charlie and was given to the Leia for saving his life, which when Polly wants to trade it for money causes a schism between them and they briefly split up. Now there are a few things to discuss with the behind the scenes, most notably the writers. So despite being the script editor, Jerry Davis is credited as a writer, and this is because the script was meant to be written by Irwin Jones, but due to other work he was unable to, and so the entire script was done by Davis. We also have the serial's director, Hugh David, who was at one point considered for the role of the first Doctor, but Verity Lambert thought he was too young. I haven't talked about Jamie much, have I? Well, that's because for as fun as Jamie is in this serial, he goes on to be a companion, and so a lot of what I've got to say about Jamie will come up in the following serials. I don't have much to say about him in this serial anyways, and so I thought I'd focus on the elements that are limited to this serial instead. But I of course have to discuss the addition of Jamie to the cast, as the original ending had the trio leaving the TARDIS without Jamie, but then after the serial was done, Innes Lloyd asked Fraser Hines if he wanted to be a full-time companion, which he accepted, which meant the production team had to go back to the original location to refilm the entire ending scene, which means that presumably the original film is now missing forever, although this is something which will come back up again at the end of War Games. This also means that Jamie is the first companion to be invited to join the TARDIS crew since Vicky, although it does feel like he's being very strongly encouraged to join them, as he's not exactly asked, and Polly's just like, we can't leave him here. So maybe he isn't a being asked companion, and instead a grey area between that and another kidnapping. Either way, we now have a new quartet with Jamie. So overall, The Highlanders is a fun enough serial, which pushes Polly more than previous serials have, and also introduces one of the longest serving and in my opinion one of the best companions of the show. It was a good enough end to the historical format of the show, and while not the most notable or memorable, it's a fun adventure. But with a new companion, the quartet end up in the near future of Earth, but soon discover the lost city of Atlantis, which is preparing to rise from beneath the sea. Next time, The Underwater Menace.